order Bill Esterson to move the motion.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Vaz. It's definitely a pleasure to serve with you in the chair, and I beg to move that this House has considered how pathways to ADHD diagnosis might be improved so people can access the right support in good time, including screening in schools. And we're here to talk about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and I'll refer to it as ADHD from here on. And we all have a pretty good idea what this means. But the reason I'm here is because a 19-year-old constituent of mine called Matty Locke took his own life in September 2023. He'd been diagnosed with autism at the age of 14, but his parents and he didn't know about the ADHD until much later. And indeed, Christine and Richard are with us this afternoon, and in Matty's memory have set up the ADHD charity, the Matthew Locke ADHD charity, and have been part of the independent task force. And one of the things the task force has done and has been accepted by the NHS, I believe, is the very proven link between suicide and ADHD. We find 10 times the prevalence amongst men of those attempting to take their own lives, for example. But just a few words about Matty. I knew Matty because he was very interested in politics. He had become a town and a parish councillor, had campaigned hard with me for some time, and those of us who knew him through politics believed he would be in this place before very much longer. It is very, very sad that this wasn't to be, and Matty was known on television as well, Matt the Vac, for his repairs of vacuum cleaners and his advocacy for domestic appliances on Good Morning Britain, and was everywhere in the community in McGaul where he lived, clearing up, playing his part as a real strong advocate for the community he grew up in and lived in. But look, his ADHD actually is linked to just how hyperactive he was. And when we talk about ADHD, we know it's people who are restless, we know it's people who lack concentration, people who are impulsive, people who act without thinking, people are always talking over others. Actually, the more I go through a list, I think I can think of up nearly 650 people in this place who have a lot in common with that description. But look, the impact of having ADHD, well, we know in school it leads to very significant school exclusions. We know it sees very high dropout rates. We know the link with addiction. We know that in prisons, people are, in the prison population, there's 5 to 10 times the prevalence of ADHD amongst people in prison compared to people outside. And sadly, we know about the link with suicide. And I want to just talk about diagnosis. The NHS figures suggest that there are something around 700,000 people waiting for a diagnosis. Many of them have waited for several years. Nearly 2/3 of those people, it's more than a year. And the economic cost is estimated around £17 billion a year. Diagnosis? I will give one.
He is giving such a powerful speech, which I think has really affected us all. In November, in my constituency, the Surrey ICB, they paused assessments on the right to choose pathway until April 2026, and this has caused major disruption. In fact, my constituent's daughter, she now doesn't know when she will be seen, or if indeed she will be seen at all. And on talking to the Surrey ICB, I know there's been a massive increase in referrals for ADHD. So does my honourable friend agree with me that the government must set out plans to improve local NHS provision of ADHD assessment?
Well, I'm grateful to her, and the example of her ICB is typical around the country, and the purpose of today's debate is to raise this with the Minister so that we can highlight just how important it is that we improve the diagnosis and speed up how quickly people are able to get access to treatment and indeed medication, I'll give way.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way and for securing this really important debate. Last year, a number of constituents contacted me because they were concerned in a similar light because Coventry and Warwickshire ICB decided to pause new ADHD referrals to those aged 25 and over so that they could prioritise children who were on their waiting list, which was at a real critical point. Now, I recently met with the Chief Executive of the ICB, who confirmed that referrals for adults will restart in May. Does my honourable friend agree with me that we must get this balance right so that children and adults with ADHD get the diagnosis and the support that they so desperately need?
I'm grateful to her. It's good news that we're seeing some progress in her ICB, and I hope that I profoundly hope that other NHS staff in ICBs around the country are watching this debate and will take the lead of her ICB in improving the access that is needed.
He's outlined some of the waiting lists, and they're no better for us in Northern Ireland. They're over a year, up to 6 years. But here's the issue for early diagnosis. Every child with ADHD has different levels of ADHD. And the diagnosis is really important, Madam Chair, because that enables the educational system to respond for that child specifically. And does he agree when it comes to tailoring the programme educationally for a child? It must be absolutely right. And you can only do that if you have early diagnosis.
Yes, I do agree with him, and it's important to realise that everybody's different and that we all need different support, and I think that's very true in school. And where I call for diagnosis, I think we need to have great care around what we mean, which is it's a means of getting support, getting the right treatment, getting the right medication, if indeed medication is right. Medication isn't right for everybody. I think there is this is a spectrum, and that individual tailored support in school and indeed in adult life, I think is a really important part of what we're discussing. And I'll give way to both of them in a moment. But I think this is a key element of the discussion, which is that we have to be really, really careful what we're calling for, and it partly explains some of the delays, which is that a specialist is the only person at the moment who can give a diagnosis because of the complexities that the honourable member just referred to. I will give way to my left first.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way, and if just permit me to do so, having met Matty on a number of occasions, like many who sit on our benches in the Northwest, certainly made a lasting impression on me from the few opportunities where we did get to meet. We know that when faced with lengthy NHS diagnosis, some people with ADHD are turning to shared care, receiving a private diagnosis before their care transfers back to the National Health Service. And I have a constituent who tried to do this for her son, but her GP is refusing to accept the private diagnosis and provide treatment, meaning my constituent is now facing huge treatment costs. Yet just a few years earlier, her other son did secure a shared care arrangement with the same GP practice. So does my honourable friend agree that we need to address some of the inconsistencies in ADHD care that are caused by long waiting times?
Grateful, Chairman. I think it's one of the asks from this debate to the Minister that these inconsistencies are ironed out. I'm glad he's raised that. I'll give way here as well.
I thank my honourable friend from Sefton Central for bringing this important debate, but also to the parents of Matty Locke for being here today. A couple of years ago, my son was diagnosed with ADHD while he was at university. And to my shame, I always thought that his behaviour was simply a case of mischief or laziness. Does my honourable friend agree with me that not only is it a case of early diagnosis, but also we need to increase the awareness of ADHD and neurodiversity more broadly amongst parents, guardians, medical professionals and government?
He's absolutely right. He's made a very, very good point. It's reminded me, my My son has been diagnosed with ADHD belatedly, like so many, when the diagnosis comes. But we were told early on that having a diagnosis wouldn't help him. How wrong that was, because the diagnosis was the key to getting the support and the understanding of what we were dealing with, both him and us as his carers. So I think there's a lot of misinformation there around, and getting this right is key, but yes.
I don't know what sorry for interrupting him slightly later. ECHP awards, they're supposed to not depend on or require a formal diagnosis of ADHD, but in practice, that is the way the local authority applies it. So families are far more likely to be challenged by the local authority if they don't have that diagnosis. But in West Sussex, my own area, the projected waiting time for assessments has now risen to 4.5 years, which could be virtually an entire secondary education. So does the Honourable Member agree with me that this catch-22 situation requires urgent action from the government?
Well, I think he's making the same point, which is that we need to clarify and have consistency across the country. And I think this is again is something that is, I hope, is going to come out of the work that the department is doing. I know they are carrying out their own review and are drawing on the work of the independent task force in doing so. I am going to give way. I'm conscious I'm at 11 and a half minutes, and there's a lot of people who want to speak. So if you're going to intervene on me from now on, please keep it brief. We'll go here first.
Based on UK-wide estimates, around 83,000 people in Northern Ireland are likely to have ADHD, yet it's clear that many remain undiagnosed, particularly in women and girls. Would the Honourable Member agree that an urgent need for clear, consistent and properly resourced diagnostic pathways across all health and social care trusts in Northern Ireland are needed, but a UK-wide based source is needed to have an even approach right across the United Kingdom?
Grateful to him. I think it's a very well-made point, repeating what colleagues have said, and I hope that professionals in Northern Ireland will have heard his point too, and we'll act on it while we're waiting for the government to get to the UK-wide approach. We will go here. You were there first.
Thank you very much, Honourable Gentleman, for putting away. I have similar stories of incredibly long waiting lists, my local ICB closing waiting lists, and general difficulty for my constituents in accessing support. Does he agree with me that the government has already had a two-part report with recommendations on dealing with ADHD, that there is plenty within there that could be implemented whilst further evidence is sought?
I do agree with that, and I know that the government, or various ministers in answers at oral questions just last week, were referring to the ongoing work. Well, I know we're due a response in the summer, and this is my opportunity to say directly to the Minister. Sometimes when governments say they're going to respond in the summer, that's a very loose term, and I hope that in this case it means early summer. And perhaps the Minister can come back to us with a little bit more clarity on when he expects to respond. I'll give way here.
Can I thank the Honourable Member for giving way, incredibly generous. Oddly, I was told by a Scottish Education Minister recently on the BBC that a diagnosis was not required in Scotland either to get the right support. We all know from our own experiences that is not the case. In Fife, we have over 40,000 children waiting neurodevelopmental assessment, and there are actually no pathways at all for adults in Fife. Does he agree with me that it's important we get this right across the United Kingdom, and the Scottish Government also need to get their skates on a little bit and take some action?
Well, let's hope there's somebody from the Scottish Government listening to the debate and acting on my honourable friend's request across the rest of the UK. We were talking before about the importance of supporting children to enable to avoid stigma in education placements, actually, but to ensure that the support is in place, that staff understand. And that they can improve their chances at school and beyond.
Will my honourable friend give way on that point?
I will give way on that.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and securing this incredibly important debate. I think you're right to raise the issues of ADHD waiting lists, and the Health Secretary is right to commission the review that's needed to rising demand. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the right response is to understand and then fix the system with empathy, rather than often, as I see in my constituency, blaming parents who are simply doing the best they can for their children?
It's a good point, and we have to get away from that very inappropriate approach that I'm sure all of us have come across from time to time. I just want to say a very few words about alternatives to diagnosis. I mentioned briefly that typically at the moment it's a specialist psychiatrist who carries out the diagnosis process. And yet there are many GPs and other health professionals who would very willingly step in and be in a position to carry out that diagnosis. And I wonder whether, and again it comes out of the review of the work of the independent task force, I wonder whether there is a big opportunity here to speed up by the use of GP diagnosis and indeed expanding the role of GPs and other professionals who want to specialise in ADHD. Might be a way of overcoming the problem we heard before about the shared pathway challenge between private clinics and GPs in prescribing as well. Mutzvaz, there are a number of challenges here undoubtedly in moving this forward, in addressing the very lengthy waiting lists and the consequences for people that I've described. I hope that the government will pick these up and address the recommendations of the task force in a timely fashion, as I was saying a moment or two ago. It will make sense for improving the ability of GPs and other professionals to assess and to support in managing ADHD. It will make sense to improve screening in. It will make sense to improve screening in schools. Extending training for GPs onto an extended role pathway is another recommendation, and the point about shared care between specialists and GPs too. All of this can enable cuts in waiting times and improve life chances and improve the prospects for very many people. I decided to put in for this debate in Matty Locke's memory, but looking around the room at how many honourable members are present, I can see that this has touched so many lives across the entire United Kingdom. So whether it is for Matty, for anybody who has been profoundly affected, for the loved ones, for Christine and Richard, and for so many other people, we have a duty to act. We know what is needed. We know how we can address these concerns. And if the government is minded to respond, we can build a system that supports those people living with ADHD and supports those people who want to care for them and improve their lives.
To remain standing because I'm due to take the wind-ups at 5:23. Just give us 2 seconds while we work out whether we need to have a hard or soft time limit. I'm afraid it's going to be a 2-minute time limit, but you can do it as Olivia Dean sings, be kind to each other, or I can put a hard limit on it. So we'll start with a soft, 2 minutes. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Ms Faz. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair. I will be brief. In York, we know that the children are waiting 2.5 years to get a diagnosis, and adults are not on a waiting list, they're literally in a car park. They fill in a performer and then they go no further. Although I am assured by services that if people face a crisis, that services will be there, although less convinced of that fact. In York, therefore, we've been thinking about how we can reconfigure services. And this is my specific ask to the Minister. We know that over a child's life, the local authority has got that controlling mind over providing that support, providing that holistic support for children, particularly those children with special educational needs. And yet, we have a segregated service in CAMS. The two aren't integrated. And as a result of that, we're not looking at a child holistically. We're seeing them in their two sections, the mental health of a child and then the holistic needs of a child. That does not work. And therefore, I ask the Minister if we are able to bring those services together, at least through a formal partnership, and if not that, to put the controlling mind under the Director of Children's Services to ensure that they can deliver a holistic need. Because as the Honourable Member for Sefton Central said so eloquently in his speech, what we need to ensure is that we're getting the functional needs of those children met. Of course, a diagnosis is an important part on that pathway, but when we're talking about people on a whole spectrum of needs, a diagnosis only partially describes the needs of an individual. But if we are able to build the holistic support that a child needs, then we are able to ensure that a child gets the security they need in a timely way and integrate that with the rest of the work that's being done on SEND from the Department of Education and ensure that we really see the integration and transformation that this government can bring.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Ms. Baz. And I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Sefton Central for securing this debate and for raising awareness of the case of Matty Locke. I should also declare a quick interest that as the chair of the APPG on Special Educational Needs and Disabilities and as one of the openly neurodiverse members of this House, I have dyspraxia, dyslexia and, surprise, surprise, ADHD. As someone with personal experience, I know how transformative a timely diagnosis and the right support can be, something I unfortunately did not receive as a little girl. I was often considered disruptive, described as having little focus, and I was also described as lazy and not meeting my potential. I was moved to the naughty boys table, aged 7, away from my friends, and even though my handwriting was atrocious, I still struggled to read, and I had a very difficult emotional dysregulation and lack of attention and fidgeting. No one would ever have considered back then that I was neurodiverse. Now, it's been many years since then, and since I was at primary school, but I would have hoped the situation would have progressed. Unfortunately, though, it's hard to hear again and again parents and children battling a system to get their needs recognised. And it's troubling to hear that from constituents that are in similar situations to what I was in the early 90s. And the barriers that they're currently facing to get ADHD assessments, medication and therapeutic input. And these are not isolated cases, as we've heard, and for both children and adults, waiting for several years is become the routine. Yes, I'll give way.
Thank you, friend, for giving way. In the last few weeks, I've visited 2 alternative learning projects in my constituency. One is the Wheels project, which is getting kids to work on restoring cars. The other one is Enemy of Boredom, which is a brilliant thing. It's getting them video gaming, but learning at the same time. And what's amazing is they only do half a day a week there, but it transforms their experience of mainstream education. They're much better when they get back in the classroom because they've had that focused attention on something they love doing. Does she agree with me we ought to do more of that?
Absolutely, and just to go back to myself again, in a very ADHD way, I did art and drama alongside sciences. I became a scientist before I came here, but without the art and drama, I would never have succeeded in science. So I think it's really important that we do make sure that we're working with people's strengths, because the alternative for not doing that is huge. We've heard about suicide rates, prisons, we've also heard about unemployment in young people, and kind of young people being blamed for being unemployed, even though they've got ADHD and have obviously gone through a session where people are not getting the support they need. But like I say, the ADHD task force has all the answers and should be looked at urgently by the government.
Friend from the member for Sefton Central for securing this really important debate. Delays in and problems relating to ADHD diagnoses are not just a marginal administrative issue, but a profound failure of our system to meet medical needs early, effectively and equitably. For too many children and adults, long waits for diagnosis can negatively shape their entire life trajectory, harming their educational attainment, mental health, employment prospects and personal relationships. NHS estimates
So estimates suggest that 2.5 million people in England have ADHD, including nearly 500,000 children and young people. Yet demand continues to vastly outstrip capacity. In September 2025, over 60% of both adults and children had been waiting more than a year for an ADHD assessment. In my own constituency of Dewsbury and Batley, Rachel reached out to me, rightfully outraged at an 18-month-long wait time for ADHD assessment, with Kirklees Council working through a backlog from November 2022. Another, Laura, has spoken about her difficulty in accessing medication even after diagnoses. The pressures on councils has been increasing on all fronts, with funding over the last 14 years of the previous government decreasing at the same time. So this isn't a blame for the council, but they do need support. I will give way.
Thank you to the member for giving way, and he makes the point very strongly that long waiting times mean that children are being left behind. As we've heard today, last week it was revealed that many integrated care boards are capping the number of assessments without telling GPs or patients. So does the member agree that a child's access to diagnosis and support should not depend on where they live or whether their parents can afford to go private?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. I completely agree. We should not, and we hear this phrase a lot, have a postcode lottery around our country for access to essential healthcare and educational services. Everybody should have equal access to the support that's available for other people without having to go private. The consequences of these delayed assessments are stark. Families are pushed towards private assessments they cannot afford, entrenching a two-tier system that makes a mockery of the NHS's spirit of free care at the point of use by rendering access contingent upon income. One other area, the Justice Gap reports that around 25% of prisoners have ADHD, and many enter the system not having been diagnosed, and they are more prone to reoffending. So in conclusion, to give time to my other colleagues to speak, I would argue and urge the government to look at this issue at a holistic level, as mentioned by my honourable friend from York Central, and provide the support both for children, adults and offenders, and I believe that that would be an investment that would render a greater return. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Bazin. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I rise to speak today as chair of the APPG for ADHD, and as someone who is from a neurodiverse household, or neurospicy as we call it, very spicy, I understand the difference that support can make and the consequences when that's missing. I want to address an elephant in the room, because there has been a lot of talk about ADHD being overdiagnosed. I understand why that question gets asked, but the evidence does not support it. The NHS ADHD task force has been clear. ADHD is under-recognised, under-diagnosed and under-treated. Diagnosis rates are well below what prevalence suggests, and some trusts are so overwhelmed, as we've heard, they've paused new referrals, not because demand is inflated, but because services cannot keep up. And when ADHD goes undiagnosed, it doesn't disappear, it shows up elsewhere. So it shows up in health services through higher rates of coexisting conditions and crisis-driven care. Untreated ADHD costs more than £13,500 per person each year. Early diagnosis and treatment save money and reduce the burden on the NHS. It shows up in our schools, so children with ADHD are more likely to be excluded, miss school or face bullying. Many have literacy challenges and other conditions that compound when support comes too late. And it shows up, as we've just heard, in the criminal justice system. So 1 in 4 people in prison have ADHD, compared with 1 in 20 in the general population. Without support, people are more likely to develop risky coping strategies, including substance misuse. So diagnosis isn't a magic bullet, but it is a starting point. It shifts people from blame to understanding and only works when followed by support across education, workplaces and public services. Which brings me to the key issue. We still don't have a clear national picture of how long people are waiting for within the NHS, and I'd like to put that to the Minister.
Of 2 minutes. Andrew Cooper.
Congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Sefton Central, on securing the debate. And I'd just like to say he knows my links to his constituency, and I'm certain that the moving tribute he gave of Matt will be appreciated by his family, his Labour family, and everybody that knew and loved him. I just want to thank him for that. ADHD affects people of all ages, backgrounds and communities, and yet too many are stuck on waiting lists for years, during which time their needs go unmet and their well-being deteriorates. In the limited time I have, I want to make 3 points, really. The first is to do with barriers and gatekeeping. I think I've received so many cases of schools refusing or postponing referrals, adults reporting, GPs minimising symptoms, and community peds increasingly rejecting referrals even when evidence is clear or a private diagnosis exists. And these gatekeeping practices, they don't protect services, they merely protect delay, and they lead to wider mental health problems in the long term. I think the second point I wanted to make is around the right to choose. We've all, I'm sure, had cases through our mailbag of where a constituent has been forced to obtain a private diagnosis because of delays on the waiting list, only to find that the NHS will reject the assessment, won't provide the medication that they need, will not play fair on the shared care agreement. This is wholly improper. And the third point I wanted to make was about an individual that I assisted who his referral to adult services wasn't made in time before community paediatrics stopped prescribing as he transitioned from being a child to being an adult. And due to excessive waiting lists, this person has now been without ADHD medication since March 2025, and this is just indicative of a system that isn't working properly. I just want to ask the Minister, will he address the systemic barriers to the ADHD pathway, including...
Thank you, Ms Vaz. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And thank you to my honourable friend from Sefton Central for highlighting this hugely important issue. My inbox, like many people's, is full of parents with children who are struggling, especially those that have comorbidities. So, combined with other conditions, doubly disadvantaged, and whose unmet needs cause significant harm to their physical and mental health, hugely increasing their complexity and meaning years of education are not used to maximise their potential. There seems to be a catch-22 in Warwickshire with ADHD waiting lists. Coventry and Warwickshire ICB now stands at over 7,500 children, a 10-year waiting list for some. They often do not accept ADHD referrals for under 7s. So potentially, despite the evidence showing that this period, the early period, is when the interventions are most impactful. Potentially, the earliest a child can expect a diagnosis is 17 after their entire educational career. The adult waiting list, as we heard from my honourable friend from North Warwickshire and Bedworth, has been closed since May 25 due to reopen this year, and we very much welcome it. But this provides a very narrow window for assessments between when a child can actually get through the waiting list and not be considered an adult. To further complicate issues, children that have been referred for general neurodiversity assessments, there is difficulty ensuring a consistent pathway back to ADHD assessments and the waiting list. I would very much welcome a defined pathway so that there is certainty for children, professionals, to make sure that they receive the support that they need.
A number of colleagues have spoken very movingly today about the individual circumstances of their constituents, and I wanted to speak just a little bit about individual circumstances. I was diagnosed with ADHD last year, and I recently bumped into a friend at an event, and they had also been diagnosed with ADHD, and they said to me, when you first took your medication, and I am one of those people with ADHD who takes medication, she said, when you first took your medication, did you get emotional as well? And the answer was, yes, I did. And I got emotional for the same reason so many people with ADHD become emotional the first time they take their medication, because you realise what so many other people have been able to live like for so many years. and you realise that you're not lazy, you're not stupid, you're just a little bit different, and you need that little bit of extra support. And I think the honourable member is so correct to make the point that diagnosis is a gateway to support, not a means of itself. And when I speak to so many people with ADHD, it's an almost universal experience, the difference that that diagnosis, that support makes. Many describe it as life-changing. I certainly do. And so I think one point I'm really keen to make is that in these discussions, and it's so good to hear from colleagues who are willing to share their experiences as well, in these discussions it's so important that we recognise that an ADHD diagnosis is not a problem to be managed. It's not a game about numbers. It's about supporting people, identifying a challenge, something to resolve, something to support them with that otherwise might have been treated as disruptive behaviour, and instead support them to give them the ability to be their best, their most productive selves. And just very briefly in the time that I have left, I just wanted to turn to the point around the number of young people not in employment, education or training with ADHD, and just to ask the Minister if he could touch on, in his response, whether the independent review into mental health conditions, autism and ADHD prevalence will interact with the review from the DWP around NEET rates as well.
Squeeze the wind up. I think, Mr. Esterton, you had quite a fair bit to start with, and maybe the front benchers if you don't use up your full time. Sarah Hall.
Thank you, Ms. Faz. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. Right now, too many people in Warrington South are being failed by the system that's meant to help them. Demand for assessments, people with ADHD, demand for ADHD assessments has risen sharply, with waits of up to 6 years back home in Warrington. As someone with ADHD myself, diagnosed as an adult, I know firsthand how difficult it can be to navigate a system that often doesn't join up or listen properly. Ahead of this debate, I asked constituents in Warrington South to share their experiences seeking an ADHD diagnosis. Adults told me they waited years for assessment, only to be pushed through mental health pathways that didn't fit, prescribed medication that made things worse, and while waiting, some self-medicated with alcohol or drugs, not to escape, but simply to cope. Years of masking, burnout and misdiagnosis had taken their toll. Parents told me their children were identified early in nursery or reception, but support stalled because schools are restricted in what they can do without a diagnosis. By the time the referrals are finally made, children are already struggling, falling behind, or believing they're lazy or stupid. I heard from women diagnosed in their 40s, 50s and 60s after lifetimes of being treated with anxiety or depression that never quite made sense. Teachers contacted me too, experienced, committed professionals who want to help, but who are trying to meet complex needs in classes of 30 or more children with limited support and resources. They told me that diagnosis means very little if there's no capacity to act on it. And in Warrington, concerns about waiting times came up again and again. Misdiagnosis, problems in education, workplace breakdown, mental health crises, families forced into private care if they can afford it, while others are simply forced to cope until they can't cope anymore. So when ministers point to frameworks and data improvements, I say this: those things matter, but they do not help the child struggling in school today or the adult in crisis being told to wait until the next decade. This is not about ADHD being overdiagnosed. It's about a system that consistently undertreats and undersupports those who have it. We desperately need more specialists, more appointments, more assessments and waiting lists that are measured in months, not years.
Thank you, Ms. Aslan. Thank you to my honourable friend for bringing this important debate today. He's spoken powerfully about the long and agonising waits many people have to endure to get an ADHD diagnosis. But today I want to focus on what happens next, because for many people, receiving a diagnosis is not the end of the fight. In many cases, it is the start of a new one. Time and time again, I hear from people who, after finally securing that elusive diagnosis, they then encounter a whole set of new barriers preventing them from accessing that treatment that they are entitled to. In January 2025, local medical committees in Suffolk and Essex advised GPs to stop delivering ADHD treatment under shared care agreements. And a survey by Health Watch Suffolk of people's experiences of the changes to shared care found that only 40% had received prescriptions or monitoring from their GP, and of these, just 69% said their GP had already stopped or would soon stop providing this support. Most only received 2 or 3 months' notice that their shared care agreement was ending, and some had no notice at all. Patients are left in limbo. They've been diagnosed, maybe even stabilised on medication, and are suddenly told that their shared care agreement is ending. And in some instances, people are left with no access to medication whatsoever. I've received letters from terrified parents and their families panic-stricken at the prospect of being left without the medicine that they need to function every day. I am looking forward to hearing the Government's response to the ADHD Task Force recommendations, and I welcome the launch of the independent review into the prevalence and support for mental health conditions, ADHD and autism. Reducing waiting times for assessment and diagnosis is absolutely critical, but that work is rendered futile if we do not also address the crisis of timely access to medication and support. And for too many of my constituents, and I'm sure for many across the room too, the hardest part of their ADHD journey did not end with diagnosis, it simply began there.
Now go to the Lib Dem spokesperson, Adam Dance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chair. I'd like to declare an interest as Vice Chair of the ADHD All-Party Parliamentary Group and someone with ADHD. I'd also like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Sefton Central for securing this important debate. It's good to hear and see so many members here today. We've seen that with the time limit. I think we could have spoke for a good 2 to 3 hours on this. But I think the most important thing this debate has done is highlight the importance of ADHD diagnosis, because it makes me so angry when I hear the media or politicians talk about a crisis and overdiagnosis. As the NHS ADHD Task Force report tells us, the evidence is clear. ADHD is under-recognised, underdiagnosed and undertreated, including with medication. Higher... I will.
Very briefly, I'm really grateful to him for giving way, but the Minister really does need to hear, I would think you would agree, that in places like Dorset, whole conditions are just being ignored. We have the same situation as in Suffolk. ADHD, bariatric service, eating disorders and gender dysphoria of all having their shared care cancelled. Whole cohorts of people are being given no GP services. Would he agree that that is outrageous?
I completely agree with my honourable friend. We're seeing this across the board when lots of conditions. Thank you for bringing it. Higher diagnosis rates over recent years reflect greater awareness, but an overdiagnosis crisis. As someone with severe ADHD, I can tell you the life-changing difference an ADHD diagnosis can make. Is why I'm stood here today. But I'm one of the lucky ones. Too many people with ADHD are not having their needs identified or supported. That is a real crisis here. As of March 2025, over 500,000 people were waiting for an ADHD diagnosis. In Somerset, the average wait time is around 2.5 years, if you're lucky. Like many honourable members, I see firsthand the dire consequences of this crisis. A constituent of mine, who I cannot name, reached out to me about her son, who, like many nowadays, went through school without having ADHD diagnosed, despite family constantly fighting for support. The bright lad recently left school without qualifications, but he was just dismayed by his teacher as challenging. The lack of support left him vulnerable and hopeless. Now he is suspected of getting mixed up with county line gangs. We see this far too often. It breaks my heart because this is not an example case. Around 25% of people in our prisons have ADHD, though that is probably an underestimated. As I found out in a response to a written question, the Minister of Justice does not hold data on the number of people in prisons with ADHD centrally. I've heard from so many, including those that are not able to work or have come out of prison, who said if they just had their ADHD identified and a little bit of help, their life could have gone so differently. For those only interested in the important impact of state finances, the estimated economical cost of not identifying and treating ADHD is around £17 billion to the UK economy, though I think that is seriously underestimated. That is why it's important that we identify people's needs early, and that is why I've put forward a bill calling for universal screening for neurodivergent in primary school age children. It is cost and time effective way to identify every children's needs early and put in place non-medical interventions like changes to teacher training that do not require diagnosis. It would also provide high-quality data for medical references where necessary. The last point is really important because at my SEN roundtable, a local paediatrician told me a huge barrier to former identifying and supporting needs early is a lack of high-quality data, information sharing across the sector and non-medical interventions. So I hope the Minister will be able to tell us today whether universal screening of neurodiversity will be considered in the important review of ADHD and autism or the school white paper. But we cannot just stop identifying needs early. For many with ADHD, a formal medical diagnosis is vital. A diagnosis opens treatment pathways, accommodation at school or work, or state support. That is why the Liberal Democrats are calling on the government to provide greater funding to integrated care boards to set and treat new ADHD patients. Especially, we need greater support for community-based projects and services for those living with ADHD. In Somerset, we are getting new programmes like this, but we need the funding to roll them out and recruit and retain more professionals in the NHS to diagnose and support ADHD. So can the Minister reassure us that any reforms to clinical pathways to ADHD will not see communities and ICBs that serve them lose any funding and support? Can he also update us on the progress NHS Digital has made on the NHS improvement programme?
Thank you, Joan. It's a pleasure to be here and respond as His Official Majesty's opposition. And can I thank the member for Sefton Central? He has done a truly epic tribute to Matty Locke to get so many MPs here on such an important topic. The only thing I'm sad about is we could have had a 90-minute debate and filled that easily. So maybe that's a note for next time when he applies to take it forward. Time is short, so I will skip through to the questions that are most important here. Because I think this was titled about ADHD diagnosis. There's no discrepancy on either side across the House about the difficulty and the challenge facing us as we've seen the numbers go up. So the question is, what is the government prepared to do about it, and how can we as this House work to facilitate the government with that? Before the last general election, the previous government worked with the NHS England to establish the independent ADH task force, which we've talked about. The aim was to develop a data and improvement plan. Now, as we've heard from the floor, we've had 2 iterations of this. Yet it was confirmed by the government in a written ministerial answer to the PQ from the member for Broxtowe on the 17th of November. The minister sat in front of me that they are considering these recommendations. So I'd be grateful for an update from the government as to whether we will hear about the recommendations today, if not when, and if so, will they be taking on all the recommendations from that task force, or whether there'll be others that they will be looking at to challenge. I also commend the government on commissioning its own independent review into autism and ADHD. As we've heard, often linked, there can be comorbidities. It's really important that they are considered. But as we've heard also, we haven't got a distinct timeline for this. Summer is a long period of time, so I'd be grateful if the Minister could set out exactly when summer is defined by the government and how that will intertwine with the work already done by the task force. Does it get superseded, or actually is this a dovetail of work that could be carried on to work together? Finally, I'd like to pull together the idea of accountability and delivery, because I understand that NHS England has identified reducing long waits for ADHD assessments as a priority within the medium-term planning framework. But with NHS England set to be abolished, it's unclear how these priorities will be maintained and enforced. So will the Minister confirm that reducing these long waits for ADHD assessment will remain explicitly a national priority for the NHS, and actually how the government is going to enforce that, given the NHS England is being taken away, especially across the consistency of integrated care boards? And on that point of integrated care boards, I welcome the acknowledgement again in a recent written parliamentary answer that data on ADHD waiting times at ICB level is currently not held centrally, but there is an intention to publish it in 2026 or 2027. This transparency is really going to matter. So will the Minister confirm the plans to publish ICB level ADHD waiting time data will continue regardless the structures of the NHS after it's changed? And will it provide an indicative timeline for the delivery? Is it 2026 or 2027? And within that, we've heard it talked about quite a lot, the right to choose. Will the government be publishing more data around the right to choose? What is successful? What is not successful? What is good practice? What could be improved practice? Because at the end of the day, that is one of the ways we can deal with the postcode lottery. Because at the heart of this debate, it comes down to the fact that behind those numbers is a person, a child or a family seeking answers, seeking support and seeking some stability. And it is our duty in this House to hold the government to account to deliver that for all across the nation.
Thank you. Minister Dr. Zubair Ahmed.
Ms Faz, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. Can I start by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Sefton Central, for securing what is, I think, by all acknowledgement, an important debate on ADHD. And can I also thank other members, honourable members, for their valuable contributions today, particularly the members for Hertford and Stortford, Sheffield, Hallam, Warrington South and Yeovil for sharing personal experience, which has been invaluable, I think, to this House. We have heard, of course, today moving testimonies, and I want to thank everyone who shared personal and family experiences, but I want to personally express my welcome and deepest sympathies to the parents of Matthew, Locke, Christine and Richard, and thank them for being here today, and thank them for all the invaluable work they have been doing with the Department and NHS England to raise awareness of the issues surrounding ADHD and suicide to the charity they have set up in Matthew's memory. We have learned through this debate the intersection between ADHD, other mental health conditions and suicide risk. Every suicide is a profound tragedy, leaving families and friends and communities devastated. That is why, in addition to our approach to ADHD, mental health and autism, we are committed to delivering the suicide prevention strategy for England, which aims to address the risk factors contributing to suicide, to ensure that fewer lives are lost, and we work across government to improve support to those who are suffering or have been bereaved by suicide. We know people with ADHD have co-occurring neurodevelopmental conditions, and so not only must we intervene early, but we must also assess people with suspected neurodevelopmental conditions, of which I will say more later. We must ensure that following diagnosis, people have the right support to meet their needs, including mental health needs. The government has already taken significant steps to stabilise and improve NHS mental health services, but of course, there is so much more to do. Transforming the system always takes time, but we are committed to delivering a new approach to mental health. The 10-year health plan sets out ambitious reform that we are wishing to undertake and make it fit for the future. In line with this, we will go further to ensure that NHS mental health services deliver the care that people deserve and rightly expect. The Staying Safe from Suicide guidance published in 2025 means all mental health practitioners now must follow the latest advice in understanding and managing suicide. This training is now available to all NHS and non-NHS mental health staff. Following the tragic loss of their son Matthew, Richard and Christine have been keen to ensure that other families are made aware of the increased risk of addiction and suicide associated with ADHD. NHS England has worked closely with them to revise content on the nhs.uk website and has also included separate tailored content on ADHD for adults, children and young people. We have also specifically seen the highlighting of increased risk of suicide and addiction in those with ADHD, including signposting anyone who might be struggling to find urgent help and support, and updated the wording to reflect lived and clinical experience. I would like to extend my thanks again to them for all of their input to this work and invite them into the department to meet me and alongside my colleague, the Mental Health Minister, to see how we can go further faster. We know, Madam Chair, too many patients are facing long waits to access services, including ADHD assessments and support. I know there are issues that these issues are affecting our constituents up and down the country, as has been reflected in the debate today, and I understand the devastating impact this has on individuals and families. Lord Darcy's report laid bare the growth in demand for ADHD assessments nationally, and this has been so significant in recent years that it risks completely overwhelming the resource available. I want to thank everyone who has taken part in sharing evidence with Lord Darcy's report and the subsequent ADHD task force established by NHS England. We know during that task force report there are quality concerns with assessments, there's been rapid growth in remote assessments and use of the independent sector, and we are urgently looking into this. That's why work is currently underway to improve ADHD services, both in the short and long term, to meet the needs of those waiting for an assessment or those needing treatment for a diagnosis.
On that point, you mentioned the task force. They did produce their report. They did have the recommendations, and the government hasn't yet responded to those recommendations. Could you give a timescale of when he looks to do so?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have met the chair of the task force. We discussed the outcomes, and we also discussed the need, as he said in his speech, for it to dovetail with the prevalence review. I think that would be the most appropriate way to provide a holistic response, and we of course respect the findings of the report, which is an excellent scientific piece of work looking at the data underpinning these diagnoses.
Is he just clarify then, if it's going to dovetail, is he suggesting that the recommendations will then come out at the report in the summer when it's all at one lump, or will we see the recommendations of the task force coming before that, before we see the full report of the new commissioned work?
So I think at present, you will have to ask that question of my colleague, the Mental Health Minister, of the specifics. But my understanding is the prevalence review will be the wider piece of work, which will partly be informed by the ADHD task force report. And these, it would be better for these to be answered as a combination rather than individual reports. To the prevalence review, you will know that the House will know that the Secretary of State announced this on the 4th of December 2025 and launched the independent review into prevalence and support for mental health conditions, ADHD and autism. This will bring together the most respected researchers and clinicians and voluntary organisations in the country, alongside, crucially, people with lived experience, and they will be directly engaged to scrutinise the evidence and to support the development of recommendations. Now, we know, of course, part of that is how we address and label reporting, and I would have an expectation that we do come up with a better definition and a better way of reporting than we have at the moment. The Government's 10-year plan sets out the core principle of early intervention and support and will make the NHS, of course, fit for the future. Through the NHS Medium-Term Planning Framework published in October 2025, NHS England has set an expectation that local ICBs and trusts improve access, experience and outcomes for ADHD services over the next 3 years. I also heard the call from honourable members for the need for much more integration between community mental health services, GPs and other healthcare bodies. It is our expectation that through the NHS Reform Bill and through the disbanding of NHS England and the production of independent health authorities and strategic commissioning, that will be better able to serve the needs of children requiring assessment for mental health conditions and ADHD. And so we will end up having that helicopter view that currently is not possible.
If, for example, access to work could be looked at, which currently has a 6-month wait for self-employed people to access it, and it's obviously a form of early intervention, getting people the support they need to stay in work.
I thank my honourable friend for her very valid point. And to that point, I think it is important to mention that the prevalence review, it is our expectation, will align with the review that the Department of Work and Pensions is carrying out on employability and other issues affecting disability in addition. Madam Chair, the NHS in England is working with ICBs who are trialling innovative ways of delivering ADHD services and is using this information to support systems to tackle ADHD waiting lists and provide support to address people's needs. I understand it is increasingly clear to patients and staff that the current highly specialist ADHD assessment model does need to evolve quickly, moving to a more generalist service model, and this could improve care and reduce waiting lists, and this was one of the task force's key recommendations.
Regarding the prison population, it's approximately a quarter, which is 22,000, give or take. Will the government commit to doing an assessment of an impact assessment of what savings the government could make and how many people's lives could be improved by helping assess prisoners either before they commit a crime or after?
Yes, the honourable gentleman will know that a lot of things are under my purview, but prisons are not. But his point is well made. I would have an expectation that during the prevalence review, such subgroups would be investigated and interrogated. I do only have 2 minutes, Madam Chair, so I will move on very, very quickly and not test your patience. In the longer term, we do recognise the need to understand the factors behind the rise in demand of services. We recognise that ADHD and autism frequently co-occur, and which is why it will be important for the prevalence review to look at the conditions holistically as well as individually. In closing, I want to acknowledge the impact that delays to accessing assessments and diagnoses are having on people. I thank my honourable friend for Sefton Central for tabling this really important and timely debate. I hope the actions I have set out today, including that of the prevalence review and how it will dovetail into other reviews and other departments, will provide some reassurance to the honourable gentleman and to the other colleagues that we are taking these matters extremely seriously and with a parity of esteem to any physical health condition or issue. I hope you and your constituents start to feel, I hope all honourable members' constituents start to feel that progress very soon.
Thank you. Balestis, you have a few seconds to wind up.
In which I will say thank you to all who've taken part and given their own testimonies, their own experiences. My honourable friend from Hartford and Stortford described the benefits of treatment and medication in just exactly the same way as a constituent of mine did, the difference in recognising that you can live your life the way that others do. Can I thank the Minister for what he said about Richard and Christine, how they've already had an impact, and can I just make this plea to him for early implementation of at least some of the findings ahead of the final
Order. The sitting stands adjourned.